The earlier events which had given the sculptor's vision and carving such importance to my uncle were the focus of the second part of his lengthy document. It seemed that on a previous occasion, Professor Angel had beheld the infernal shape of the unnamed horror, pondered the unfamiliar symbols, and listened to the threatening sounds that can only be written in a certain way, and all within such an alarming and dreadful context that it is no surprise he hounded the young Wilcox with questions and requests for information. This prior incident had occurred many years earlier, when a prominent academic society held its yearly gathering. Professor Angeles was fitting for a person of his standing, and accomplishments had played a notable role in all the proceedings, and was among the first to be consulted by the various non-members, who used the assembly to present queries for accurate answers and puzzles for specialists. Resolution. The principal of these visitors, and very soon the center of attention for the whole event, was an ordinary-seeming man of middle age who had journeyed from a distant southern city for particular details not available from any source nearby. His name was John Raymond LeGrasse, and he worked as a police inspector. He brought with him the reason for his trip, a bizarre, disgusting, and seemingly very old stone figure whose origin he could not identify. It should not be imagined that Inspector LeGrasse had the smallest interest in ancient studies. Quite the opposite. His desire for understanding was driven by entirely professional motives. The figure, idol, charm, or whatever it might be, had been seized some months earlier in the wooded wetlands below that southern city, during a raid on a suspected occult gathering. And so peculiar and horrifying were the ceremonies linked to it that the authorities could not help but understand they had uncovered a dark sect completely unfamiliar to them and far more evil than even the worst of the local voodoo groups. Of its beginnings, aside from the irregular and incredible stories forced from the captured participants, absolutely nothing could be learned. Hence the eagerness of the police for any antiquarian knowledge which might assist them in identifying the frightful symbol and through it trace the sect to its source. Inspector LeGrasse was hardly ready for the stir which his object caused. One look at the thing had been sufficient to throw the gathered scholars into a condition of keen agitation, and they quickly pressed around him to stare at the small figure, whose complete strangeness and aura of genuinely profound age hinted so powerfully at sealed end. Ancient horizons. No known tradition of carving had given life to this dreadful item. Yet centuries and even millennia seemed recorded in its faint and greenish surface of unidentifiable stone. The idol, which was eventually handed slowly from person to person for close and careful examination, was about the height of a man's hand and of remarkably skilled craftsmanship. It depicted a monster of vaguely humanoid silhouette, but with a head like an octopus whose face was a tangle of tentacles, a scaly, pliable-looking body, enormous claws on its back and front feet, and long, slender wings behind. This entity, which seemed filled with a dreadful and unnatural malevolence, was of a somewhat swollen fatness, and squatted malevolently on a rectangular stand or base covered with unintelligible markings. The ends of the wings touched the rear edge of the block. The seat was in the middle, while the long, curved claws of the bent crouching back legs gripped the front edge and reached partway down toward the pedestal's bottom. The squid-like head was inclined forward, so that the tips of the facial tentacles brushed the backs of huge front paws, which clasped the crouching figure's raised knees. The appearance of the whole was unnaturally realistic, and the more subtly terrifying because its origin was so completely obscure. Its immense, awe-inspiring, and immeasurable age was evident, yet it showed not one connection to any known style of art from the dawn of civilization, or indeed from any other era. Entirely separate and distinct, its very substance was a puzzle for the soapy, greenish-black stone with its golden or shimmering specks and layers resembled nothing known to the study of rocks or minerals. The characters along the base were equally perplexing, and no one present, despite a representation of half the world's expert knowledge in this area, could form the slightest idea of even their most distant linguistic relation. They, like the subject and material, belonged to something horribly distant and separate from humanity as we understand it. something frightfully suggestive of old and unholy cycles of existence in which our world and our ideas have no place. And yet, as the members individually shook their heads and admitted defeat regarding the inspector's problem, there was one man in that assembly who sensed a touch of bizarre recognition in the monstrous shape and writing, and who presently related with some hesitation the odd bit he knew. This individual was the late William Channing Webb, a professor of anthropology at a famous university and an explorer of some reputation. Professor Webb had been involved many years before in a journey to northern regions in search of certain inscriptions which he failed to find, and while far up on a western coastal area, had met a peculiar tribe or cult of degraded native people whose religion, a strange form of devil worship, chilled him with its deliberate savagery and repulsiveness. It was a faith of which other natives knew little, and which they mentioned only with terror, saying that it had come down from horribly ancient epochs before the world was even formed. Besides nameless rites and human sacrifices, there were certain odd hereditary rituals directed at a supreme elder devil, and of this Professor Webb had taken a careful phonetic record from an aged shaman or wizard priest, writing the sounds in our letters as best he could. But just now of foremost importance was the fetish which this cult had revered, and around which they danced when the northern lights leaped high over the icy cliffs. It was, the professor stated, a very rough carving of stone, containing a hideous image and some cryptic writing, and as far as he could tell, it was a crude parallel and all essential aspects of the bestial thing now lying before the meeting. This information, received with suspense and amazement by the assembled members, proved doubly thrilling to Inspector Legrasse, and he began at once to press his informant with questions. Having noted and copied an oral chant among the swamp cultists his men had arrested, he begged the professor to remember as well as he could the syllables recorded among the diabolus natives. There then followed a thorough comparison of details, and a moment of truly odd silence when both detective and scientist agreed on the near identity of the phrase common to two hellish rituals so many worlds apart. What, in essence, both the native wizards and the southern swamp priests had chanted to their kindred idols was something very like this. The word divisions being guessed from traditional pauses in the phrase is sung aloud. Legrasse had one advantage over Professor Webb, for several among his mixed blood prisoners had repeated to him what older participants had told them the words meant. This text, as given, ran something like this. And now, in response to a general and urgent request, Inspector Legrasse recounted as fully as possible his experience with the swamp worshippers, telling a story to which I could see my uncle attach deep significance. It savored of the wildest fantasies of myth makers and mystics, and revealed an astonishing degree of cosmic imagination among such mixed blood outcasts as might be least expected to possess it. On a certain day, there had come to the southern city police a desperate plea from the swamp and lagoon country to the south. The settlers there, mostly primitive but good-natured descendants of old adventurers, were in the grip of stark terror from an unknown thing which had stolen upon them in the night. It was voodoo, apparently, but voodoo of a more terrible kind than they had ever known, and some of their women and children had vanished, since the malevolent drum had begun its incessant beating far within the black-haunted woods where no dweller went. There were insane shouts and harrowing screams, soul-chilling chants and dancing devil flames, and the frightened messenger added, the people could stand it no more. So a group of 20 policemen, filling to carriages and an automobile, had set out in the late afternoon with the trembling settler as a guide. At the end of the passable road, they got out, and for miles splashed on in silence through the terrible cypress woods, where daylight never penetrated. Ugly roots and malignant hanging loops of moss hindered them, and now and then a pile of damp stones, or fragment of a rotting wall intensified by its hint of morbid habitation, a gloom which every malformed tree and every fungus islet combined to create. At length the settler huddle, a miserable cluster of huts, came into sight, and hysterical dwellers ran out to crowd around the group of bobbing lanterns. The muffled beat of drums was now faintly audible far, far ahead, and a curling shriek came at irregular intervals when the wind shifted. A reddish glare, too, seemed to filter through the pale undergrowth beyond the endless avenues of forest night. Reluctant even to be left alone again, each one of the cowed settlers refused point blank to advance another inch toward the scene of unholy worship. So Inspector Legrasse and his 19 colleagues plunged on unguided into black arcades of horror that none of them had ever trod before. The region now entered by the police was one of traditionally evil reputation, largely unknown and untraveled by white men. There were legends of a hidden lake unseen by mortal sight, in which dwelled a huge, formless white polypous thing with luminous eyes, and settlers whispered that bat-winged devils flew up out of caverns in inner earth to worship it at midnight. They said it had been there before the earliest explorers, before the indigenous people, and before even the wholesome beasts and birds of the woods. It was nightmare itself, and the sea was to die. But it made men dream, and so they knew enough to keep away. The present voodoo orgy was, indeed, on the very fringe of this abhorred area. But that location was bad enough. Hence perhaps the very place of the worship had terrified the settlers, more than the shocking sounds and incidents. Only poetry or madness could do justice to the noises heard by Legrasse's men, as they forced on through the black morass toward the red glare and muffled drums. There are vocal qualities peculiar to men, and vocal qualities peculiar to beasts, and it is terrible to hear the one when the source should yield the other. Animal fury and orgiastic license here whipped themselves to demonic heights by howls and squawking ecstasies that tore and reverberated through those nighted woods, like pestilential tempests from the gulfs of hell. Now and then the less organized wailing would cease, and from what seemed a well-drilled chorus of hoarse voices would rise and sing-song chant that hideous phrase or ritual. Then the men, having reached a spot where the trees were thinner, came suddenly in sight of the spectacle itself. 4 of them reeled, 1 fainted, and were shaken into a frantic cry which the mad cacophony of the orgy fortunately deadened. Legrasse dashed swamp water on the face of the fainting man, and all stood trembling and nearly hypnotized with horror. In a natural clearing of the swamp stood a grassy island of perhaps an acre's extent, clear of trees and tolerably dry. On this now leaped and twisted a more indescribable horde of human abnormality than any but a master of the grotesque could paint. Void of clothing, this hybrid spawn were braying, bellowing, and writhing about a monstrous ring-shaped bonfire, in the center of which, revealed by occasional rifts in the curtain of flame, stood a great granite monolith some 8 feet in height, on top of which, incongruous in its smallness, rested the noxious carved statuette. From a wide circle of 10 scaffolds set up at regular intervals with a flame-girt monolith, as the center hung, head downward, the oddly marred bodies of the helpless settlers who had disappeared. It was inside this circle that the ring of worshippers jumped and roared, the general direction of the mass motion being from left to right in endless revel, between the ring of bodies and the ring of fire. It may have been only imagination, and it may have been only echoes which induced one of the men, an excitable foreigner, to fancy he heard answering calls to the ritual from some far and unlit spot, deeper within the wood of ancient legendary and horror. This man I later met and questioned, and he proved distractingly imaginative. He indeed went so far as to hint of the faint beating of great wings, and of a glimpse of shining eyes and a mountainous white bulk beyond the remotest trees. But I suppose he had been hearing too much native superstition. Actually, the horrified pause of the men was of comparatively brief duration. Duty came first, and although there must have been nearly 100 mixed celebrants in the throng, the police relied on their firearms and plunged determinedly into the nauseous rout. For 5 minutes the resultant din and chaos were beyond description. While blows were struck, shots were fired, and escapes were made. But in the end, Legrasse was able to count some 47 sullen prisoners, whom he forced to dress in haste and fall into line between 2 rows of policemen. 5 of the worshippers lay dead, and the severely wounded ones were carried away on improvised stretchers by their fellow prisoners. The image on the monolith, of course, was carefully removed and carried back by Legras, examined at headquarters after a trip of intense strain and weariness. The prisoners all proved to be men of a very low, mixed-blooded, and mentally aberrant type. Most were seamen, and a sprinkling of other races gave a coloring of voodooism to the heterogeneous cult. But before many questions were asked, it became manifest that something far deeper and older than local fetishism was involved. Degraded and ignorant as they were, the creatures held with surprising consistency to the central idea of their loathsome faith. They worship, so they said, the great old ones who lived ages before there were any men, and who came to the young world out of the sky. Those old ones were gone now, inside the earth and under the sea, but their dead bodies had told their secrets and dreams to the first men, who formed a cult which had never died. This was the cult, and the prisoners said it had always existed and always would exist, hidden in distant wastes and dark places all over the world until the time when the great priest from his dark house in the mighty city under the waters should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway. Someday he would call, when the stars were ready, and the secret cult would always be waiting to liberate him. Meanwhile, no more must be told. There was a secret which even torture could not extract. Mankind was not absolutely alone among the conscious things of Earth, for shapes came out of the dark to visit the faithful few. But these were not the great old ones. No man had ever seen the old ones. The carving idol was the great priest himself, but none might say whether or not the others were precisely like him. No one could read the old writing now, but things were told by word of mouth. The chanted ritual was not the secret that was never spoken aloud, only whispered. The chant meant only this: only 2 of the prisoners were found sane enough to be executed, and the rest were committed to various institutions. All denied a part in the ritual murders, and averred that the killing had been done by black-winged ones which had come to them from their immemorial meeting place in the haunted wood. But of those mysterious allies no coherent account could ever be gained. What the police did extract came mainly from the immensely aged half-breed named Castro, who claimed to have sailed to strange ports and talked with undying leaders of the cult. In the mountains of a far eastern country, old Castro remembered bits of hideous legend that paled the speculations of mystics, and made man and the world seem recent and transient indeed. There had been eons when other things ruled on the earth, and they had had great cities. Remains of them, he said the deathless eastern men had told him, were still be found as gigantic stones on islands in a vast ocean. They all died vast epochs of time before men came, but there were arts which could revive them when the stars had come round again to the right positions in the cycle of eternity. They had, indeed, come themselves from the stars and brought their images with them. These great old ones, Castro continued, were not composed altogether of flesh and blood. They had shape, for did not this star-fashioned image prove it? But that shape was not made of matter. When the stars were right, they could plunge from world to world through the sky. But when the stars were wrong, they could not live. But although they no longer lived, they would never really die. They all lay in stone houses in their great sunken city, preserved by the spells of the great priest for a glorious resurrection when the stars and the earth might once more be ready for them. But at that time, some force from outside must serve to liberate their bodies. The spells that preserved them intact likewise prevented them from making an initial move, and they could only lie awake in the dark and think whilst uncounted millions of years rolled by. They knew all that was occurring in the universe, for their mode of speech was transmitted thought. Even now they talked in their tombs. When, after infinities of chaos, the first men came, the great old ones spoke to the sensitive among them by molding their dreams, for only thus could their language reach the fleshly minds of mammals. Then, whispered Castro, those first men formed the cult around tall idols which the Great One showed them. Idols brought in demiurges from dark stars. That cult would never die till the stars came right again, and the secret priest would take the great priest from his tomb to revive his subjects and resume his rule of earth. the time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside and all men shouting and killing and leveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves, and all the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. Meanwhile, the cult, by appropriate rites, must keep alive the memory of those ancient ways and shadow forth the prophecy of their return. In the elder time, chosen men had talked with the entombed old ones in dreams. But then something happened. The great stone city, with its monoliths and sepulchres, had sunk beneath the waves, and the deep waters, full of the one primal mystery through which not even thought can pass, had cut off the spectral intercourse. But memory never died, and the high priest said that the city would rise again when the stars were right. Then came out of the earth the black spirits of earth, moldy and shadowy, and full of dim rumors picked up in caverns beneath forgotten sea bottoms. But of them old Castro dared not speak much. He cut himself off hurriedly, and no amount of persuasion or subtlety could elicit more in this direction. The size of the old ones, too, he curiously declined to mention. Of the cult, he said that he thought the center lay amid the pathless desert of a distant land, where a mythical city of pillars dreams hidden and untouched. It was not allied to the European witch cult, and was virtually unknown beyond its members. No book had ever really hinted of it, though the deathless Eastern men said that there were double meanings in a certain forbidden book of a mad poet, which the initiated might read as they chose, especially the much-discussed couplet. Legras, deeply impressed and not a little bewildered, had inquired in vain concerning the historic affiliations of the cult. Castro, apparently, had told the truth when he said that it was wholly secret. The authorities at a local university could shed no light upon either cult or image. And now the detective had come to the highest authorities in the country, and met with no more than the northern tale of Professor Webb. The feverish interest aroused at the meeting by Legras's tale, corroborated as it was by the statuette, is echoed in the subsequent correspondence of those who attended. Although scant mention occurs in the formal publications of the society, caution is the first care of those accustomed to face occasional charlatanry and imposture. Legras for some time lent the image to Professor Webb, but at the latter's death it was returned to him, and remains in his possession, where I viewed it not long ago. It is truly a terrible thing, and unmistakably akin to the dream sculpture of young Wilcox. That my uncle was excited by the tale of the sculptor, I did not wonder, for what thoughts must arise upon hearing after a knowledge of what Legras had learned of the cult, of a sensitive young man who had dreamed not only the figure and exact symbols of the swamp-found image and the northern devil tablet, but had come in his dreams upon at least 3 of the precise words of the formula uttered alike by northern diabolist's hand. Mixed blood Southerners. Professor Angel's instant start on an investigation of the utmost thoroughness was eminently natural, though privately I suspected young Wilcox of having heard of the cult in some indirect way, and of having invented a series of dreams to heighten and continue the mystery at my uncle's expense. The dream narratives and cuttings collected by the professor were, of course, strong corroboration, but the rationalism of my mind and the extravagance of the whole subject led me to adopt what I thought the most sensible conclusions. So after thoroughly studying the manuscript again and correlating the mystical and anthropological notes with the cult narrative of Legras, I made a trip to see the sculptor and give him the rebuke I thought proper for so boldly imposing upon a learned and aged man. Wilcox still lived alone in a certain building, a hideous Victorian imitation of older architecture, which flaunts its stuccoed front amidst the lovely colonial houses on the ancient hill, and under the very shadow of the finest Georgian steeple in the country. I found him at work in his rooms, and at once conceded from the specimens scattered about that his genius is indeed profound and authentic. He will, I believe, sometime be heard from as one of the great decadents, for he has crystallized in clay and will one day mirror in marble those nightmares and fantasies which certain modern authors evoke in prose and others make visible in verse and in painting. Dark, frail, and somewhat unkempt in aspect. He turned languidly at my knock and asked me my business without rising. Then I told him who I was. He displayed some interest, for my uncle had excited his curiosity in probing his strange dreams, yet had never explained the reason for the study. I did not enlarge his knowledge in this regard, but sought with some subtlety to draw him out. In a short time, I became convinced of his absolute sincerity, for he spoke of the dreams in a manner none could mistake. They and their subconscious residue had influenced his art profoundly, and he showed me a morbid statue whose contours almost made me shake with the potency of its black suggestion. He could not recall having seen the original of this thing except in his own dream carving, but the outlines had formed themselves insensibly under his hands. It was, no doubt, the giant shape he had raved of in delirium. That he really knew nothing of the hidden cult save from what my uncle's relentless questioning had let fall, he soon made clear. And again I strove to think of some way in which he could possibly have received the weird impressions. He talked of his dreams in a strangely poetic fashion, making me see with terrible vividness the damp, gigantic city of slimy green stone whose geometry he oddly said was all wrong, and hear with frightened expectancy the ceaseless half-mental calling from underground. These words had formed part of the dread ritual, which told of the great priestess dream vigil in his stone vault, and I felt deeply moved despite my rational beliefs. Wilcox, I was sure, had heard of the cult in some casual way, and had soon forgotten it amidst the mass of his equally weird reading and imagining. Later, by virtue of its sheer impressiveness, it had found subconscious expression in dreams, in the carving, and in the terrible statue I now beheld, so that his imposture upon my uncle had been a very innocent one. The youth was of a type, at once slightly affected and slightly ill-mannered, which I could never like, but I was willing enough now to admit both his genius and his honesty. I took leave of him amicably, and wished him all the success his talent promises. The matter of the cult still remained to fascinate me, and at times I had visions of personal fame from researches into its origin and connections. I visited the southern city, talked with Legras and others of the old-time raiding party, saw the frightful image, and even questioned such of the mixed blood prisoners as still survived. Old Castro, unfortunately, had been dead for some years. What I now heard so graphically at first hand, though it was really no more than a detailed confirmation of what my uncle had written, excited me afresh, for I felt sure that I was on the track of a very real, very secret, and very ancient religion whose discovery would make me an anthropologist of note. My attitude was still one of absolute materialism, as El wished it still were, and I discounted with almost inexplicable perversity the coincidence of the dream notes and odd cuttings collected by Professor Angel. One thing I began to suspect, and which I now fear I know, is that my uncle's death was far from natural. He fell on a narrow hill street leading up from an ancient waterfront swarming with foreign mongrels, after a careless push from a Negro sailor. I did not forget the mixed blood and marine pursuits of the cult members in the South, and would not be surprised to learn of secret methods and rites and beliefs. Legras and his men, it is true, have been let alone, but in a northern country a certain seaman who saw things as dead. Might not the deeper inquiries of my uncle after encountering the sculptor as data have come to sinister ears? I think Professor Angel died because he knew too much, or because he was likely to learn too much. Whether I shall go as he did remains to be seen, for I have learned much now. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like, share it with others, and subscribe for more content.